So, yes, welcome everyone to the Platonic Academy Melbourne, and welcome to the fourth annual Eric Timewell Memorial Lecture. I'd like to welcome members and students, and also I can see we've got a few visitors here. And just for you, the Platonic Academy has been going for now 7 years, and we promote Plato and Platonism. And we also want to have a special welcome to folks online who are joining us, many from the USA, which is wonderful. So our speaker tonight. And I'll just say, if you guys can, when we're speaking, just put yourselves on mute. That would be great. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to take questions. Jen, we'll see how we go with that, but I hope we will be able to take questions online as well. Now, before we start our events, we first of all always have a reflection of gratitude. Gratitude that we can speak freely about these matters of politics, morality, religion, and sometimes it's controversial. So some of us are not so lucky, including some of our online students in the past don't have the freedom of speech that we have. And we have to be constantly vigilant about our freedom of speech because it's currently under challenge in Queensland, in New South Wales, and also in the USA, where we have some people joining us, as you might know. But it's coming here as well, just down the road at Melbourne University. The university has been very successful in restricting free speech recently on its students and on its staff. And even here in this building a couple of weeks ago, a meeting not dissimilar to this was cancelled by the City of Melbourne at short notice without what they then admitted was a spurious reason, security concerns. So we do need to be vigilant and we do need to be brave in speaking up to preserve our rights to free speech. Also, before we start, we also reflect on the fact that this is a colonial state and that we are here in Australia on stolen land. Now, this lecture is in memory of Eric Timewell. Some of us in the room will know Eric as a fellow student and a teacher in the early days of the Academy. Eric was a psychotherapist by trade and died suddenly in 2023. He was a keen student and he taught especially the geometry of music, which inspired many of his students. Now, the proceedings today is we're going to first hear from our speaker, then there'll be a question and answers with our speaker, and then we'll adjourn for some refreshments. Now, normally, this is an afternoon gig, but because we have time zone issues, it's occurring around lunchtime. So we'll have refreshments. I'm not sure you could call it lunch, but hopefully you'll have a bit of a snack as well. Okay. So now I get to the very important moment of introducing our speaker, Dr. Benjamin Studebaker. He's a political theorist in the USA, and he received his doctorate at Cambridge University. He's published a couple of books and many journal articles. Particularly relevant to us is the article Plato as a Theorist of Legitimacy. After reading this article, I was very keen to have Benjamin come and speak to us. His approach to Plato's Republic is very different from my own and also very refreshing. A bunch of us at the moment are deep into reading Plato's Republic. Any of them in the room at the moment? There's a couple online as well. Yes. So we're deep into it at the moment. And at our last class on Tuesday night, there was much anticipation for this talk. So now I hand over to Benjamin, and will tell us, Benjamin, about building the beautiful city.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here all the way from the United States. I'm very excited to give this talk about Plato, and I've even got some slides that I spent the better part of the last 2 days on. So I'm quite keen. So of course, this was the image in the advert for this talk, which is the famous presentation of Plato to Dionysius in Syracuse. This is an element of Plato's life that is controversial because it comes from a text, the seventh letter, that has a rather controversial position in the Platonic corpus. So there are kind of three different views about the seventh letter. One is that it is a completely authentic letter, that Plato wrote it. The second would be that it wasn't written by Plato, but it was written by someone who was a near contemporary of Plato's and who knew a lot about his life. If it was written by a contemporary of Plato's, you wouldn't be so sure that you could use it to adjudicate questions about Plato's philosophy, but you might nonetheless be able to use it to get some historical context, some biographical information about Plato, which might nonetheless be useful to you. Of course, the third position is that it's a total forgery from much later on, with details that are completely made up, and that you can't trust it in any respect whatsoever. And you can find at any point in the modern period scholars in all three of these camps. And it's a very hotly debated issue. People get very worked up about this question of the seventh letter. It's one of the quickest ways to get people really, really piping mad at each other. So the seventh letter takes Plato all the way out to Syracuse. Syracuse, of course, is a Greek city in Sicily. And it's one of a number of Greek cities in southern Italy, Sicily, and also in parts of France that were settled by Greeks who had become kind of surplus population. They ran out of land to farm in Greece and needed somewhere to go where they could make a living. And so they would go and they would found these Greek colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean. And Syracuse is the most famous of these. At this point, it becomes a very significant buffer state between the Carthaginians and the Romans. And Syracuse also gives us the term tyrant. The ruler of Syracuse is called a tyrant. And of course, the tyrant in the Republic, for those of you who have read far enough along in the Republic, is the worst kind of person for Plato. Infamously, the absolute worst type of person there is, the least happy, and with the worst kind of soul. Nevertheless, according to the seventh letter, Plato goes to Syracuse several times, and he goes with political intentions. So there are 3 trips. In the first trip, he's invited by Dion, who is then the brother-in-law of Dionysius, who is the tyrant. And Dion invites Plato because he studied under Plato, and he thinks that if Plato comes to Syracuse and is presented to Dionysius, that Dionysius will be taken with philosophy and that he will become a philosopher king. And then it might be possible for Syracuse to be transformed and to become a much better kind of city in which all sorts of things are possible. And Dion says to Plato, you've got to come out here. You've got to do this. And according to the text of the letter, Plato doesn't want to seem unwilling to act, unwilling to make an attempt if called upon to do so by other people. And so, although Plato has stayed out of Athenian politics, he stayed out of the politics of the democracy, he chooses to go to Syracuse and get involved in the politics of the tyranny, so of the absolute worst type of regime, according to the Republic. As you might expect, it doesn't exactly work out. There is a falling out between Dionysius and Plato. Plato criticizes Dionysius for being beholden to his desires and not really being in charge of the city or of himself. Dionysius doesn't like this. And the seventh letter doesn't make the claim that Plato was sold into slavery, but subsequent Roman texts, which discuss this trip, claim that this is what happened, that Plato was sold into slavery by Dionysius and had to be purchased by his friends. Sometimes in some texts they say he was ransomed, but he was enslaved and then purchased by his friends. He gets back to Athens. Some years pass. Dionysius is gone. His son, Dionysius II, assumes the throne as the tyrant. And Dion says, come back, come back. Dionysius is gone. Dionysius II is a young person who's at an earlier stage of life. He's potentially someone who's you could shape, you could mold him. We can try this again. So even though Plato was sold into slavery and ransomed, according to the Roman sources, he nonetheless chooses to go back to Syracuse a second time. Now, when he comes back to Syracuse, Dionysius II is rather taken with him. But many of the people in Dionysius's court become concerned that Plato is a vehicle for Dion to gain influence over Dionysius II, and they hope to influence Dionysius II for their own purposes. So they pit Dionysius II against Dion and say that Dion is trying to use Plato to ensorcel him and control him. So Dionysius II becomes concerned about Dion's influence, and he exiles Dion from Syracuse. Then he tries to get Plato to keep teaching him without Dion's presence, thinking that perhaps without Dion, he'll be able to learn from Plato without the mediation of this potentially dangerous, very wealthy, influential Syracusan aristocrat. But Plato refuses to continue teaching Dionysius II. And so Dionysius II locks him up and imprisons him in the fortress and holds on to him and tries to get him to continue teaching. But Plato refuses to continue teaching, given how Dionysius II has treated Dion. Plato is not willing to continue teaching. And he also, in the seventh letter, seems to say various disparaging things about Dionysius II, that he would seem like he understood, but he didn't really, that he was full of himself, he would think he had an understanding, and then he wouldn't listen to anybody and would pontificate on the basis of his partial and incomplete understanding. All sorts of disparaging things are said about Dionysius II's ability to be a philosopher. So eventually, Plato is released. Now, after two failed attempts, you would really think there wouldn't be a third one. But what happens? Well, Dionysius II writes to Plato and says that if Plato comes back to Syracuse, Dionysius II will restore Dion's property. But if Plato doesn't return, he will give all of Dion's property away and sell it off. So not wanting to abandon his friend, Plato, at this point with much reluctance, agrees to come back. And to give you a sense, the age that Plato is thought to have gone on these trips, around 40 for the first trip, around 60 for the second trip, and around 67 for the third trip. So Plato goes back, and what happens when he goes back? Dionysius II breaks all of the premises. He hems and haws about returning the property. He says, maybe I'll give back some of the property, but not all of it. And then ultimately, he doesn't give any of the property back. And Plato is sent outside the palace. He is again accused of potentially conspiring with the enemies of Dionysius II. And eventually, Plato manages to get a boat after the winds change, and he gets off of Sicily and flees back home. So these three trips all involve Plato trying to get involved in politics, get involved in the worst kind of politics in the worst kind of place. If you take this story seriously, it makes it harder to read Plato's corpus as anti-political or as championing a contemplative life or a private life over an active political life. But of course, if you deny this story, then it becomes possible to read a lot of the politics out. Now, in antiquity, the seventh letter was widely assumed to just be Plato's own true account. You will see the seventh letter mentioned in all sorts of ancient texts, but not ancient texts that are immediately contemporary to Plato. So it begins to show up in the historical record during the Hellenistic period, so during the period after the conquests of Alexander the Great. You see it mentioned allegedly by Aristophanes of Byzantium in 200 BC, but we don't actually have his text. We have a later text saying that mention of the seventh letter is in his text. Then we have explicit discussion in preserved texts from Roman authors, Cicero, Thrasilius, Diogenes Laertius, Plutarch, Plotinus, Proclus, all mention the seventh letter directly or mention things that they otherwise wouldn't have any source for apart from the seventh letter. Now, through those Roman authors, it then influences the Neoplatonic theorists. So we get the seventh letter coming into the work of Plotinus and Proclus and Porphyry and Iamblichus and Julian. And of course, through Neoplatonism, it has influence on Judaism, Christianity, Islam, how all of those religions interact with Platonism. So we're going to run through some of the different ways in which this more political understanding manifests in particularly the Neoplatonists, and then also to some extent Christian and Muslim theorists, to kind of give you a sense of what are some of the different types of interpretations that come out of this more overtly political reading. So one of the things that we get a lot of in Neoplatonic writing is a kind of ladder of virtues. So virtues are understood by Platonists to be capacities. They're not simply moral traits or praiseworthy traits. If you have a virtue, that means you actually have the capacity to do something. But the thing that you have the capacity to do is something that it's good to do. So there's both a moral and a political element to virtues. There's both a normative and a descriptive element. To have a virtue is not just to be praiseworthy in some way, but it's also to be able to do something in particular. Now, the way the ladders of virtues generally work is that you have to get the lower levels of virtue to be able to get access to the higher levels. So the lower levels are prerequisites that unlock the higher levels. Now, the basic level is natural virtue. So natural virtue is kind of natural talent or a natural disposition for potentially being philosophical to some degree. Depending on the Platonist, for some Platonists, there's a lot of people who lack the natural aptitude for philosophy or the natural inclination to be philosophical. And if you don't have this natural disposition, then you won't even really get going properly. So you have to start with some level of natural potential or natural disposition. That natural disposition can then be developed through the ethical virtues. These are to do with habits. They're pre-rational. They don't involve necessarily approaching the behavior at the level of reason. They would look more like the habits that you might associate with Aristotle, where people are from a very early age trained into regular patterns of behavior. And these regular patterns of behavior give rise to regular thought patterns that are good or useful or helpful, thought patterns or behavior patterns through which to live. But a person who's purely at the level of ethical virtues will not be self-conscious or self-reflective about all of this. They won't have arrived at it through reason, but just through habituation. The political virtues we're going to talk about in more detail. They're the next layer up, and they involve actual use of reason, but use of reason in a way which is in accordance with the desires that most people have. Once you go up beyond the political virtues, then you're getting into virtues that are to do with becoming quite special and very much different from most other people. So the thought is that most people who could be citizens of a Greek city could potentially develop political virtues. But if you're going to ask people to develop virtues that go beyond that into the purificatory zone, you're going to find that a lot of people just don't have the natural philosophical interest in doing that, or that it's extremely difficult to construct the kind of environment in which an interest in developing and a capacity to develop those kinds of virtues arises. And the purificatory virtues are about reducing the intensity of desires reducing the range of desires down to a more manageable set, preparing the soul for more purely contemplative activity. The theoretical virtues involve thinking about concepts in and of themselves, thinking about the nature of the cosmos, the way in which the cosmos works, but with some distance from that. So thinking about this from outside it. The paradigmatic virtues involve overcoming the separation between the thinker and the thing that is being thought about. So once you enter into the paradigmatic terrain, you get into kinds of non-dual thinking. And you see some of this sort of non-dual thinking in things like the Parmenides, the dialectic between the one and the many. You know, to talk about the one, you have to point to examples of it. And when you point to examples of the one, you come up with many different things. So there's a sense in which the one is many, but also all of the many emanates from or comes from the one. So there's a sense in which the one and the many are the same thing, even though that seems to be contradictory. Paradigmatic virtue involves not just dealing with that kind of contradiction at the level of thought as an object, but coming to embody that, reaching a point at which you yourself become identified with the divine and recognize the sense in which the divine is already operating in you. Now, that's a quite esoteric idea to just describe in language. And part of the difficult thing about these higher ranked virtues for Plato, particularly if you go by the text of the seventh letter, at one point in the seventh letter, there's an explicit claim that this stuff can't be written down in such a way that it can be straightforwardly communicated, because it requires that the soul be ready to receive or to understand. And language hits different people different ways, depending on the condition of their soul. You can't simply, by conveying an idea in words, bring about in the soul an understanding of that idea. Lots of ideas can only be arrived at after long periods of contemplation or socialization or education or civic preparation. And you'll recognize in the Republic, there's all this talk about this very lengthy education process for the guardians, where they're only introduced to dialectic at the age of 30, which means prior to the age of 30, they wouldn't even be introduced to theoretical virtue at all. They wouldn't even be trying to approach dialectical thinking as an object external to themselves. That would only begin at the age of 30. And then you're talking about maybe by the age of 50, people would be ready to intervene in the politics of the city. Now, that intervention in the politics of the city, that comes about through theurgic virtue. So when you reach the point of theurgic virtue, and this is a category that Iamblichus introduces, it's not a category that's in every Neoplatonist, but it is there in Iamblichus. And theurgic virtue involves not just reaching paradigmatic virtue, but then on the basis of the paradigmatic virtue, descending back down into the cave, into the city, and trying to construct at the level of laws, at the level of rituals, at the level of the built environment, a context which will give rise to these lower levels of virtues in the citizens of a place. So theurgic virtue involves this capacity to design the world, to make the world in such a way that the divine is realized in it. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. And Iamblichus says there are all sorts of people who think they're doing theurgic virtue, but they're engaged in a kind of sorcery. They're doing something else with religious rituals or with law that isn't really about this raising of the soul up to its highest level. So let's focus in a little bit more on the political virtues. You will recognize them from the Republic as the cardinal virtues in Western philosophy. These would be practical wisdom, or sometimes in Latin, prudence, courage or fortitude, moderation or temperance, and then justice. Typically, practical wisdom or prudence will be to do with judging cases and recognizing what a particular situation demands. So it will be context sensitive, sensitive to history, sensitive to the kinds of situations that you're in. So it deals with particulars and with the recognition of the role particulars play in the realization of universal principles. Courage or fortitude is to do with being able to be virtuous in less favorable situations, situations where it's hard to be virtuous, situations where maybe a person who isn't so courageous would succumb to something. And that could be, people think about it in the context of war, running away from danger, but it can also just mean agreeing to eat something that you shouldn't eat because everybody else is doing it and people are partying and having a good time. It can appear in all sorts of different situations where, because of the social or civic pressure, there's an invitation to surrender or give up virtue in some area of life. Moderation or temperance is similarly to do with not overindulging, but also with recognizing when you have to restrain your own ambition. So, for instance, if you're always trying to bring about the very highest kind of Platonic politics and you don't pay attention to the conditions, there's a sense in which that would be an immoderate attachment to the good. We have this expression, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. This can be framed as to do with moderation and to do with temperance. And then you've also got justice. And justice is, of course, at the center of the Republic and involves this question of giving to each their due, each in its appropriate role, each doing what it's supposed to do and not other stuff that it's not supposed to do, each being treated the way it ought to be treated given who it is, what it has done. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about the political virtues is that you can define them and discuss them and frame them in ways such that they all seem to lead into each other. You can't talk about just one of the political virtues without invariably talking about it in ways which seem to invite talking about the others. And this is in part why the political virtues are considered together as a set. They're also considered together as a set because they involve a certain amount of reason, and therefore they require a certain level of education. This would not just come out of the habits that a child is taught by their parent. It would not just come out of natural disposition. It's something that you would have to be trained in some way to acquire, something that would be difficult and not obvious, not straightforward. So, in trying to bring about the political virtues, there's this need to create the conditions under which people are able to acquire them. So to construct a kind of environment where rigorous training can occur of reason and of the capacities of reason in the soul. Because this won't happen automatically, it requires very careful thinking about rules, how you're going to spend your time, how you're going to organize your day, because it is not something that just arises spontaneously from human nature. It's not a moral power that we all just obviously have and can straightforwardly develop if we're just left alone to our own devices. It requires very, very careful structuring. And the level of ambition that a Platonist has will tend to shape where they think that structuring ought to occur. So the lowest level is the reform of souls in an environment like the Platonic Academy or in a Platonic school. So at this level, the goal is to create an institutional environment that allows the people who attend that environment to gradually over time acquire the political virtues. And then once the political virtues have been acquired, then there may be a possibility for some number of them who are able to find in themselves the love of philosophy to go beyond that into the higher tiers. The thing about an academy, though, is that because it's just an educational institution, there's a limit to how much it can shape the overall environment and the habits and the laws and the rules governing social life. It can, to some degree, be a bit of an enclave. It can allow you to have, at a small scale, patterns of life, forms of life that you couldn't have in the city as a whole. A more ambitious kind of Platonism will look to transform the conditions in the city by making the philosophers play a role in politics or in government. Now, in the laws, we have a less ambitious iteration of this. In Plato's laws, we get a system that's very much focused on law, you don't get very much talk about law in the Republic. There's much more talk about the high capacities of the guardians being extremely virtuous people, particularly the gold souls in the Republic, extremely virtuous. And so therefore having the ability to make discretionary decisions on the basis of their relatively high level virtue. In the laws, you're not assuming that you have a very large number of people like that, or that it will be very easy to sustain a government that's built around them. So instead of having a group of people who are extremely, extremely virtuous, the laws focuses on having a set of laws, a set of formal procedures that can keep everybody on track and which can play a much stronger role in habituating people. The laws tends to think, well, not only will it be difficult for most people to get the purificatory virtues, but it will also be difficult for most people to get the political virtues. So in many cases, you'll have to settle for ethical virtue, which means if you have laws which habituate the citizens, and you'll see Aristotle use this kind of language in the Politics, laws that habituate, that will cover a lot of ground for you in terms of getting you to a point where you have a city which is at least hospitable to philosophers, will at least not kill them off in the way that, of course, Athens killed Socrates off. The city of the Republic is described as a city for gods. To say that it's a city for gods might make it seem like it's a city that we're not supposed to make or that isn't meant for us. But one of the things that the Platonists in antiquity emphasize continuously is the possibility of divinization, of becoming like a god by imitating the gods, following the gods. And that this is in part a large element of how you acquire the higher level virtues. So if you can become like a god by imitating the gods, then it becomes possible to think of the Republic as something which perhaps at a relatively advanced stage of human development, you could potentially try to build. But most of the time, when Neoplatonists talk about trying to politicize their Platonism, they will talk about doing it at lower levels. Because in the context of the Roman Empire, they look around and they don't see a tremendously large number of people who seem to have the most advanced Platonic virtues. So what does this look like in practice? Here are a few different sort of examples, drawing on the Platonic corpus here, of ways of thinking about what you might do with the Platonic political virtues, depending on where you're at in the society, how much power you have, what is the context, what kinds of traits and abilities are in the people around you. So we have Sopatros, who is, this is the son of another guy named Sopatros, who was a student of Iamblichus in the late Roman Empire. And he wrote a letter to a friend giving him advice about how to be a middle-ranking official in the Roman Empire. So a middle-ranking official who's a Platonist will, of course, have the experience of being given all sorts of orders from higher-ups that he thinks are not wise, because these people who are above him, they're not Platonists, they haven't acquired the higher level virtues, so they're not really well suited to give political orders and to tell people what to do. Nevertheless, if you are living in a state where you are not able to control the higher offices, what do you do when you're given bad orders that don't make any sense to you? Well, Sopatros says you can divide these orders up into three categories. There are some tasks, of course, that you have to refuse, and maybe you'll have to pay the price that Socrates paid for refusing them. But there are other tasks that you might be able to do something with. Maybe you can put them off or delay them, and the fact that you're in that office will mean that these things happen later than they would otherwise happen. And therefore, that buys people time in which they might be able to come up with a clever response or some way of avoiding, ultimately, the worst consequences of the action that you've been told to do. And the third is your tasks that cannot be refused but can be mitigated. You could do it in a way which causes less harm than would otherwise be caused. So these are kind of arguments for how a Platonist could occupy an office in the Roman Empire in a period where the Platonists do not regard the Roman Empire as at all operating on the basis of their concept of virtue. Now, Julian, the Roman emperor, is famous for trying to repaganize the Roman Empire. He tried to repaganize the empire in part on the basis of his engagement with Neoplatonism and particularly with Plato's laws. So in Julian's effort to repaganize the empire, he assumed that there was going to be private property. There wasn't going to be an attempt to get rid of private property, as there is in the beautiful city of the Republic. He acknowledged that it wasn't going to be possible to immediately draw upon a large number of extraordinarily virtuous people. So this repaganization was going to have to be done through the law, and it was going to have to involve civic religious institutions of the kind that are described at great length in the laws. And the reason for this is that Julian thinks that he himself is not fit to be a philosopher king. He himself doesn't have the virtues or qualities that are necessary to do that. And if he doesn't have that, then his level of aspiration has to be much lower. He has to operate in consultation with other people because he can't trust his own judgment. And therefore, he's going to have to focus on structures that will create good habits that are less ambitious, that have more predictable effects. So his focal point in his reforms tends to be the proposals indicated in the laws. But you can also imagine, especially in more recent centuries, a tendency to try to do something a little bit more revolutionary, something which would exceed the law, go beyond private property, would involve a transformation of religion. But to do that in a Platonic way, it would have to be in the service of theurgy. It would have to be based on theurgic virtues, which aim at generating virtue in the whole population. If it was done out of atheism or out of naturalism or some other kind of philosophy which is non-Platonic, then it would be, from the point of view of Platonists, unlikely to have positive results. Now, one of the things I really think it's helpful to draw attention to in the Republic is the relationship in the Republic between justice and harmony, which is also sometimes called moderation in the Republic. So justice in the Republic has both legislative and judicial aspects. Justice involves both general principles, which in the Platonic corpus tend to be framed as legislative, and then it also has, there's a need to fix things that go wrong in particular situations where things go off the rails, to rectify something that's come off a bit. And that tends to be framed as judicial. So the legislative is about saying what in general should happen. And the judicial is about saying, something has come off, it has to be rectified. If justice is operating and people are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing and not going outside their box, then Plato suggests that there will be harmony or moderation, in the sense that there will be agreement about who is supposed to rule, and the people who are not ruling will not be immoderate. They won't try to claim for themselves excessive roles that go beyond. And so you see there's a sense in which moderation leads back into justice. But harmony and moderation involves, in the discussion here, the subjective beliefs, the doxa, the opinions of people. When there's harmony, there's agreement about who is to rule. When there's justice, it is actually the case that the people who ought to rule for Plato are in fact ruling. Justice leads to harmony. Harmony leads to justice. The way to lose the harmony is to violate the justice, and the way to lose the justice is to violate the harmony. So it's very tight. The way that you keep everybody in the appropriate role is to maintain the agreement, and the way to maintain the agreement is to keep everybody in their appropriate role. This can easily come off if you just make mistakes about what virtues people have. If you think somebody has virtues that they don't have, and you put them in a role that they can't perform, well, all of a sudden, that's going to encourage them to be immoderate. They're going to think that they should be doing things that don't fit with their own talents and abilities. And once they think that, then they're going to think, well, why don't we change the rules in the city so that more people like me can do these things? After all, I can do them. I've been picked to do them. Why shouldn't more people like me be doing them? So there's a tendency, once you start to misallocate the roles, for the harmony to break down. And then as the harmony breaks down, there's a tendency to further misallocate the roles. And you'll see this discussed in the Republic, specifically with regard to the timings of when people should be born. So if people are born at the wrong times, they'll end up with different kinds of souls from those that are anticipated. If people are born at the wrong times, it will be very difficult to know who actually has which natural talents. And you'll have to watch everybody very, very closely. And even when you watch people very closely, you're still likely sometimes to get it wrong because you don't have access to what's going on inside their minds. And in particular, the silver traits in the Republic, the love of honor or the love of status, these can prompt people to imitate being people who really love the good or love wisdom, because if the good or wisdom are honored, then the way to be honored is to act as if you love those things. So if you're just judging people by their outward action, it becomes really easy to blur those things together and misallocate the roles. And as soon as you have too many people who love honor or status in your guardian class in the Republic, this is going to be the beginning of the end. It's going to be the thin end of the wedge. So how do you maintain the harmony? There are a few different techniques that are discussed in the Republic for keeping the non-philosophical part of the city on board. But all of these techniques have problems. The obvious one is to enslave the people who don't have the relevant kinds of natural talents. And the reason why I say obvious is not any kind of normative endorsement from me, but it's the common practice in Greek cities. It's the thing that is going on all over the place in ancient Greece at this time. The thing about slavery is that once you have slaves, then you have to guard against those whom you've enslaved, because the slaves will be continuously trying to rebel. And that means that you're going to need to center people who have martial abilities, who tend to be interested in honor or status. So to have slavery as your mechanism for keeping the non-philosophical part of the city on board tends to result in a dependence or a reliance on the auxiliary class, on the martial status-seeking class. So nevertheless, in many cases, it seems as if there's no other way of dealing with the problem. And in the laws, Plato, while discussing to some degree the problems that will come up, nonetheless accepts slavery as a mechanism for keeping the non-philosophical parts of the city on board with it. And in the Phaedrus as well, there's a discussion of enslaving the part of the soul that otherwise isn't responsive to reason and can't be persuaded. And in many dialogues, there's a kind of exhaustion of the elenchus. There's a point where it seems as if no one is going to be able to make any more progress by talking or arguing. You think of the Gorgias, for instance, where Callicles is extremely resistant to the arguments that are being made, to the point where he's making fun of Socrates throughout the back half of that dialogue, going, "Oh yes, Socrates, so I may gratify you. I'll say yes to whatever it is that you want. This is what you enjoy, isn't it? This is your pleasure, Socrates, trying to embarrass and humiliate other people." So there's a point reached in the Gorgias where it really seems that there's no arguing with somebody like Callicles, no arguing with him. What do you do with people who can't be persuaded through an argument? What happens when you have large numbers of people that you can't persuade? Well, another strategy that is discussed is the noble lie. In the Republic, this would be, for instance, the Phoenician story, the story that everyone has the same mother, which is the earth, and that they have different kinds of metals in their souls that determine what role is appropriate to them. This is a story that naturalizes the division of labor, so as to get people who are not philosophical to sign up to it on the basis of an account of nature. The difficulty with noble lies is that oftentimes you are dealing with people who will not believe them. So the Phoenician story is famously a story that only the Phoenicians could be persuaded to believe. But the Greeks are not going to believe it. And in the Republic, when the story is discussed, Socrates says again and again, this is an incredible story. Nobody's going to believe this. Wouldn't it be amazing if people did believe it, though? But no one's going to believe it. It would take generations to produce people who might believe it. Now, in the laws, it's argued that perhaps you can, through reform of the civic religion, produce new kinds of stories that people will believe, that will protect non-philosophical people from the errors of atheism, naturalism. But there's a question. Will those stories be believed? A lot of the time now, when people read the laws and they read the kinds of stories that are proposed in the laws, they don't find those stories very plausible. When Greeks and Romans read those stories seemed more likely to be believed. The references to the Greek and Roman gods by Platonists at a time when many people believed in those gods seemed much more likely to be able to produce stories that could actually be convincing in the relevant sense. But when we go back and look at noble lies, we're less sure about certainly the lies, the specific lies that are told in Platonic dialogues. Maybe there's a new set of noble lies. Maybe there's some other set of lies that could be told now. Of course, the third thing, and this is the thing I like to focus on in my own work, is this idea that you could meet the necessary desires. So in the Republic, there's an emphasis on there being a set of desires that most people cannot get rid of, even with education. These desires are also those that benefit us in some sense, and that we are better off fulfilling them, meeting them, than not. So they're not just the desires that are to do narrowly with survival or with meeting the natural needs of the body. They are defined in such a way that they are somewhat broader than this. And in my work, I take them up in a political sense. The necessary desires have to be met sometimes for political reasons to persuade people who otherwise would not be convinced to support the project to support it. And this means giving people who are interested in honor or status or interested in a pleasurable life some of those things, rather than trying to rigidly deny them all of that stuff or to limit it to the same degree that you would limit it for, say, the philosophical class. But it's very difficult. It's hard to maintain the distinction between the necessary and unnecessary desires. There is in the Republic no permanent distinction apart from those most people cannot get rid of even with education. That's something that can change depending on your context. It might not be the same in one part of the world versus another part of the world at one time or another. And it's also a distinction that is difficult to maintain at the level of philosophy, in that a lot of the time, intellectuals will deny that this distinction exists. They'll say that there is no difference between the necessary and unnecessary desires, and that the people who are propagating this distinction are engaged in a kind of power game, trying to force you to live in the way that they think you should live for reasons that are to do with their ego or to do with their desire for status, or because it pleases them to make other people live in the way that they would like to see. So it can be difficult even to get intellectuals to observe this distinction. And you'll notice in the Republic, there are numerous points at which large numbers of people are talked about as not being able to make the distinction. The demos in democracy is described as not being able to make the distinction, and also the oligarchs in oligarchy, particularly after they've lost their thrift, had their thrift exhausted, they can't make this distinction. Insofar as the thrifty oligarchs make it, they're making it out of habit. So they're making it not because they understand the distinction at a political or higher level, but out of an ethical virtue that has been taught to them by habit, by their parents, by previous generations. And because it's only understood by them at the level of ethical virtue, they don't know how to teach it to future generations apart from the maintenance purely of habits. So when it becomes necessary to update habits, to change the way in which they produce the virtue, to meet new needs, new circumstances, they're not able to adapt. And so gradually the oligarchs lose the capacity to maintain that distinction. And once they do that, the consequence of their doing that is they become immoderate. They purchase all of the property of their fellow citizens and reduce them to the status of what Plato calls drones. So only the philosophers can reliably make the necessary, unnecessary distinction. And even they will really struggle to make it for a long period of time, because it will be difficult to figure out who is someone who can actually be a philosopher versus who is not. So the Republic is a very difficult project. Now, in Christian thinking, there are a number of different ways in which this is taken up. So here are a few different examples. And of course, we'll have Augustine's rejection of the Platonic approach to politics. But Eusebius, for instance, during the reign of Constantine, the emperor who Christianized the Roman Empire, claimed that Constantine was a divinely inspired philosopher king who was going to be able to raise the virtues and quality of the population of the Roman Empire to an unprecedented level, because unlike all of the previous people who had attempted Platonic projects, he actually had the correct religion. So Eusebius very much takes up a set of Platonic ideas about what politics is, and then simply inserts Christianity into that scheme. Now, Augustine rejects this role for politics. He makes the case that politics provides for peace, and peace allows citizens to pursue God. But this divinization process that the Platonists are interested in, this becoming like a god so that you can have extraordinarily rare kinds of human abilities, that's something that isn't possible for us on earth. That is only possible in the final judgment for Augustine. So because of that, the Platonists, in trying to realize these things through politics and through the structure of their routines and their day-to-day life, they're trying to do something which for Augustine is prideful. They're trying to raise themselves above the level of human beings and to become something that they can't actually become. Third Christian perspective belongs to Pseudo-Dionysius. He makes the case that bishops can be philosopher kings. And this can work if the emperors depend on and listen to the bishops. So the emperors don't live in such a way that you could argue that they have the higher kinds of Platonic virtues, but they could be in regular dialogue with people who could be trained in such a way that they would be able to make the relevant kinds of interventions. A very full-throated kind of Platonism can be found in the work of Al-Farabi, who treats Muhammad as the philosopher king and describes many of the rulers of contemporary Islamic states as lower-ranked rulers who therefore have to be subject to the laws that are in the Quran and can't give the law, can't serve as the legislator in the way that Muhammad could. So he makes the case that Muhammad has this very, very high kind of soul, but that nobody else who's ruling an Islamic state reaches quite that level. And then religion becomes an imitation of philosophical truth that can be used to persuade non-philosophical people. It creates a set of images or a set of experiences that provide a sort of compelling ersatz of the philosophical activity for the non-philosophical. But Thomas Aquinas in the West follows Augustine and argues that politics is about peace. What the king does is provide peace, and then in that peace, some benign things can happen. But for Aquinas, politics is not a vehicle for divinization. And this becomes, I think, a real sticking point in the history of political thought. Is politics about peace, or is politics about trying to make us all into better people? In modernity, our focus has tended to be on peace and prosperity, not this process of divinization. We've also tended to drop out that necessary-unnecessary distinction. We tend to think that if somebody wants something and they're able to get it by voting for it, or they're able to get it through participation in the market, or there's a corporation that provides the thing that they want, that makes them entitled to have it. And our laws, we have a rule of law, but the rule of law is based on well-functioning markets, well-functioning competitive multi-party elections, well-functioning corporate structures. It's not based on laws that come from theurgists who seem to have attained very high spiritual capabilities, very high philosophical capabilities. So when Plato is talked about, he tends to be depoliticized and turned into an advocate of a more purely contemplative life that is more compatible with modernity and with liberalism. And you can kind of see how this process unfolded. Hobbes in 1651 argues that classical texts should not even be taught because people who read classical texts are likely to fight and kill each other over their disagreements about what's good and how one ought to live. There is a breaking off of Plato from his reception by theorists in the 1700s, like Burker and Schleiermacher. There is an attempt by Hegel to retrofit Plato for modernity. And so Hegelianism becomes a kind of modernized Platonism. But in the Anglosphere, Benjamin Jowett rejects the seventh letter as non-Platonic forgery in 1871. And then the British analytic philosophers like G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, they follow the Enlightenment rejection of Neoplatonism as unphilosophical mysticism. And then, of course, Nietzsche, Popper, and Hannah Arendt blame Plato for inspiring Hegel and therefore Marx for totalitarianism in the 20th century. and implicating him also in nationalism. The Straussians respond by trying to protect Plato from this critique, and they make him into a liberal. They say that he isn't really for all of the things that he seems to the people from antiquity to be for, that none of them could really read him properly. And if you read his texts in isolation, and you read them many times, and you read them very closely, you'll find that his views concord much more with liberalism than it seemed to all of the people who read him in antiquity. More recently, the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, people like Quentin Skinner, have argued for reading great books in historical context, and that's led to renewed engagement with the ancient reception and with what the Straussians would consider lesser works by inferior minds. So there's been a lot more interest in and engagement with other Greek authors apart from Plato. And additionally, the tools of analytic philosophy, which were in the hands of More and Russell, used to dismiss a lot of these Neoplatonic arguments, have been used to try to give more specificity and precision to those arguments. And in doing that, those arguments have been made a little bit easier to articulate without a high degree of prejudice. And people like Vlastos have played a large role in that. And now these techniques are not just being applied to Plato, his historical context, and precise articulations of his arguments. They're also being applied to other Platonists, to people like Plotinus and people like Iamblichus, by theorists like Dominique O'Meara. Now, still, as this revival of interest in political Platonism has happened, there has been a tendency to avoid the overly radical implications by focusing heavily on the laws, on the degree to which Platonists tended to think that you couldn't do more than the laws, and arguments that the laws is really a great text and really ought to be given more attention, maybe even more than the Republic. And there's also been a continued rejection of the seventh letter, a continued doubt about whether it's an authentic Platonic text, about whether it was written near to the time when Plato was operating, the degree to which you should take seriously the story that is told there by people like Annas and also Freda and Berniat. And that kind of provides some guardrails. It makes it harder to view Platonism as this very, very radical project that might involve trying to transform tyrants into high-minded philosophical people. But as we move into the 21st century, I do want to invite us to think about what if Plato's politics is not about intervening in democracy, but is about intervening in tyranny? Because Plato didn't really intervene in Athenian politics. He was accused of having intervened in the oligarchic coup, denied his involvement in that coup. Maybe he was involved, maybe he wasn't, but he denied involvement in that coup. And then, according to the story of the seventh letter, became heavily involved in the politics of an even worse city. In a situation like tyranny, where we don't have a lot of freedom that we're potentially endangering by having aspirations that go beyond our present level of development, does something like this kind of project become more interesting? A lot of the ancient people who are receiving this stuff are receiving it in cases where they're under a Hellenistic king or a Roman emperor, or in the case of Syracuse, a tyrant, authoritarian figures who are not just stifling freedom, but also stifling the development of human capabilities, making it difficult for human beings to become virtuous people, creating social and political conditions that bring out the worst qualities in human beings. In a context like that, might this kind of Platonism become more interesting again? And I leave off here with a kind of list of some recent books in the first quarter of the new century that have emphasized a kind of diminishing of the sense in which we still seem to be democratic. Books like Colin Crouch's Post-Democracy, Jeffrey Winter's Oligarchy, Jeffrey Green's The Shadow of Unfairness, Weizsäck's The Twilight of Democracy. There seems to be real concern that we've moved into a stage of human history where we can't really rely on democracy to provide for the things and to protect against the dangers that we've previously looked to it to provide for and protect against. So it might be that now that the Soviet Union is gone, and Hegel and Marx no longer seem to have this totalitarian implication, that there will be some reopening of the thinking about this. And I'm not sure whether this is a good thing, but I do think this is something that is likely to happen. I think it is already starting to happen, and I thought I'd draw some attention to it. So that's where I'll leave off.
It's my mic and usage.
Yep.
And it's all working. Can you hear me there? Just checking that. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks once again to Benjamin for a wonderful survey of Platonic thinking there. That was wonderful. So much in it. And interesting about the seventh letter. We haven't read the seventh letter in our classes, but it used to be bound up with the Believers, I think, or the does you remember that in the Penguin translation?
The Phaedrus?
The Phaedrus, was it? Yeah, and no longer there. I'm sure you can get it online, but it is very interesting. And the seventh letter, whether it is authentic or not, as Benjamin went through all the different possibilities with that, all the different positions people take with that. It is still interesting to read, especially as Benjamin was saying, on the influence on Hellenistic, Neoplatonic, and so on, reception of Plato. And the other thing that Ben also mentioned a lot was the laws, and our previous speaker in the previous salon mentioned Plato's laws. We have not taught the laws. So we are going to teach the laws next year. It's very long. We'll work out a way that we're going to best teach the laws. And I know that there'll be some people very happy for us to do that. Okay, so I hope you've got some questions ready for Ben. I'm going to take my microphone off, and I'm going to put it on this little stand, and I'm going to ask Anthony if you could just go around the room. So we'll first take some questions from the room, and then we might try, if Jen can help us, with taking some questions online if there are any. So, okay, so any questions or comments from the room? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Second question. Yeah, thanks, Ben. My first comment is that it's interesting you mentioned Leo Strauss, that of the Straussians who, shall we say, went in politics, usually it's a philosophy or something like that, they all seem to drift to the Republican side, none to the other side, even though some of them, as students, such as Stanley Rosen, at least in his view, identified as a New Dealer, son. So that's just a comment. But my question relates to two things you said earlier in the talk. The first one was about this comic in the seventh letter, about how thought usually reaches, or speaking to each other usually reaches kind of an impasse. And later on, you mentioned, what was your term? The exhaustion of the elenchus in the Gorgias. So, but I think you were characterising it there more as a refusal to continue to argue. So my question is this: in relation to things, in relation to the figures which are pervasive and wonderful and beautiful in Plato, such as the allegory of the sun, the line, the cave, metaphor, if it's a metaphor. These figures, is there much, if anything, in Plato or after Plato by other Platonists that explain or explore why it's necessary to move from, let's say, purely discursive rational discussion to more poetic modes of expression? And if it's necessary, does that result in a kind of change in the value or the true character of the different sources of expression? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the Straussian tendency to be conservative in the United States has a lot to do with the period in which Straussianism came about. So a period of strident anti-communism. where the more political interpretation of the Republic tended to be associated with Marxists in the Soviet Union, who, if they read Platonism, read it as implying potentially communism, as a kind of early communism. And so I think one of the goals of the Straussians was to emphasize that Plato could be of help, but of help to the liberal project. And the liberal project would include at that time things like the New Deal project. With regard to the stories, with regard to the cave, the second part of the question, what was that second part again?
So is there anywhere in Plato itself?
Oh, yes. So there's a lot of talk in the laws specifically about sort of running up against what you can do with most people because of this tendency for young people, especially smart young people, to become naturalists and to think that it's natural to go around and do injustice to other people. There's some explicit talk of that in the laws. It also comes in the Republic in the person of Thrasymachus, who I read as a kind of reminder of what happened in the Gorgias. So a kind of quick way of reminding you of how the Gorgias ended up, where you get to a stage where it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to make more progress with this particular person by continuing to argue with them. So this person will be potentially a danger or a threat to you if you remain purely at the level of argument. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about the Gorgias is that Callicles is never treated as an enemy. Even as he's being very disrespectful, he's referred to over and over as a friend, and even as a dear friend. So there does seem to be this idea that you can have friends who are nonetheless kind of incorrigibly non-philosophical, but they remain your friends. And so in the Republic, there's talk of the producers as free friends. So even though these people are framed as not being philosophical and not able to commit themselves to the same form of life or even to the same overarching principle, you can still be friends with them on the basis of bringing them into the harmony. But to do that, you're going to need some sort of mechanism or device for bringing them into the harmony. The most explicit talk of it, I would say, is in the laws. But I think you see it gestured at in the way in which Thrasymachus is dealt with, and also in the way in which Glaucon's objections are dealt with. Because in the case of Glaucon, you have to not just have a discussion purely at the level of a direct discussion of what is good and what's not good and how to live and how not to live. You have to actually go through and describe the city in a great deal of detail to work through with Glaucon his interest in these luxuries and his belief that you're not going to be able to have a large number of people who are not interested in these luxuries. There's going to be a large number of people who are interested in these luxuries. So you're going to have to find some way of dealing with that. You can't just insist that these people are unreasonable, even if it is the case that they're being unreasonable.
Very good point. So I suspect that with Callicles, the book is there, and also, for example, in the Republic, when he's giving brief replies to Meletus and Anytus on, when he says, "My good friend," I think he's being ironic.
Yes, yes, you do wonder that, don't you? Yes. Anyone want to respond to that?
Yes.
It's possible. I prefer to read him as not being ironic. I like to wrestle with how it could not be ironic.
Okay, thank you for that question, Chris and Ben. I just might mention, just to bring everybody into the loop, so Straussian, Leo Strauss, he was a theorist of Plato in the mid-20th century, who we've been discussing a little bit in our reading of the Republic, because here's quite a remarkable interpretation of the Republic, with an emphasis on the fact that Plato is actually saying that I think the vast majority of the people, or even indeed the old people with the whole population with the noble eye, can't live in the true light of wisdom. We have to have these myths. That those people who read the Republic might follow what I'm saying. Now, Leo Strauss has had a big influence in the US, and it is tends to have been associated with conservative politics generally. he had a student, Stanley Rosen, and Stanley Rosen had a student called Martin Black who teaches ancient Greek language in our school. He has his own school, the Independent School of Philosophy. So if you're interested in that interpretation, you can go and speak to Martin Black. Okay, who's teaching on Monday nights in North Melbourne? He's around at the moment. Okay, now I've seen a couple of hands up. I've seen a hand up online, but we'll take one more question perhaps from the room. And if anyone else online wants to have a go at a question, then I'll get Jen to decide how to manage that. But is there anyone else from the room who has something, a question, a comment, or a reflection? Yes, okay. Oh, and by the way, before I let George speak, we have a special thank you to George for recommending Benjamin as a speaker. And so good recommendation, George. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just had a question. I feel like maybe might open up a whole can of worms, but in the talk, you didn't mention your own kind of interpretation of Platonist politics, your own kind of idea that you have been developing. So I know that in some podcasts you mentioned you're planning to write a book that synthesizes Platonism with Marxism. Sounds like a kind of your own project building Platonic politics. On the face of it, I just finished reading the Republic just on the right here, actually. And yeah, having read the Republic, I kind of interpreted it as a theory of class collaboration, social harmony. Everyone knows their place and works together. And the philosophy, of course, Platonism is very idealist. And in contrast, Marxism is materialist, and it's also like revolutionary. It's all about class struggle with the eventual goal of class abolition, the self-abolition of the working class. So yeah, I know you're writing a book about this. So without giving everything away, I was going to speak about that. Thank you.
Yeah. So on this point, I think one of the things that Marx and Plato have in common is a desire to overcome labor as the thing which principally orients life. So in the Phaedrus, he gives sort of 9 different types of souls and puts them in a rank order on the basis of what kind of role they're playing. And one of the points of emphasis that comes out of that for me is that any kind of role that somebody's in that posits most of their time as labor time tends to cause them to become focused on how the good applies in their specific domain, which has a tendency to alienate them from the good in itself. And the philosopher, because the philosopher is not engaged in some more specific craft, but is posited as a lover of the good in itself, is able to be less concerned with these particular uses and to think about how to liberate people who are in the cave from their particular uses, from the specific things that they're caught up in that come from the particular social role that they're playing. Now, in Platonism, there's various levels of confidence in terms of how many people can be liberated from that and to what degree. How many people would even be interested in being liberated from that? But I think you can think about the different types of virtue as involving getting over the particular interests that come out of one's specific role or one's specific body and identifying more and more with a greater and greater levels of abstract unity of the principle. So when you get into those paradigmatic virtues where there's a kind of overcoming of duality, that kind of non-dual experience in which a person seems to be assimilated to the divine or to recognize the sense in which they're one with the cosmos. When that happens, there's a very overwhelming overcoming of particularity, or at least that's what's posited. But something like that to happen in the Republic would require extraordinary education, extraordinary levels of organization of the kind that would be very difficult to achieve in antiquity, in part just due to the scarcity of resources. One of the things that comes out of Marxism is this idea that although modernity seems to in various ways transgress against all sorts of traditional values, there might be, through the abundance modernity generates, new possibilities that could be opened up, and that a process of alienation could be overcome at some later point by going through that process. And I'm interested perhaps in ways of bringing Marxism and Platonism back together on this point, but it would be a kind of Postonian Marxism, which would emphasize overcoming labor as the principle. It would not be, say, focused on people who are in labor ruling the city, because of course for Plato, if people who are in labor are ruling the city, then because they're in labor, they're going to be unable to develop various kinds of virtues that would require that their time be distributed differently. So I think if you were trying to assimilate Platonism into a kind of older proletarian Marxism of, say, the earlier part of the 20th century, that would be difficult and arduous. And I think it was difficult and arduous, and this is in part why Platonists and Marxists tended to have quite sharp conflicts in the early part of the 20th century. But perhaps as we are moving into later and later stages of this process of modernization, and we're getting very advanced types of technology, some of these new left ideas, which involve a sort of post-work society, could in some way interface constructively with Platonism.
Right, thank you, Ben. We'll take a question from the chat now. I have one that has a hand up for
Which is
Aris.
Aris.
Yes, hi. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And Benjamin, thank you for this fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I wish more of this could also be discussed in social circles as well. I have a couple of questions which derive from a couple of observations of mine. So I'd like to start with the first one, which is in this idea of imitating the city of the gods, as you've mentioned in the climbing ladder of the theurgic aspect. I was just wondering what kind of gods, at least, he was believed to want to imitate, right? Because if he were the Homeric gods, then we aren't really imitating something good, perhaps. And whether if we are imitating the Hesiodic gods, well, we are imitating kind of nature to an extent, right? At least my understanding. But then I personally feel that, some scholars may have argued this, we end up, Augustine, utilizing the idea of the city of the gods to then create this sharp, deleterious division that we have inherited in Europe between the city of men and the city of gods. And arguably, a lot of scholars have suggested that this idea of the division of the sacred and the secular in politics, at least until Elizabeth I, and even further in the early modern period, has been one of the most deleterious issues that has been the cause of strife and civil wars in all medieval and early modern period. We have this, in Hobbes, in Spinoza, and so forth. And so they are trying to grapple with this idea of artificiality and this construction of and the division of power, right? So this is one thing that I like to point out. And a lot of scholars, even German American like Eric Voegelin, they've tried to understand where this idea of divinization come from. And they have pointed out to the Renaissance. Yeah, Voegelin pointed out that it was the Neoplatonic Renaissance through Gnostic and Hermetic ideas that has created this kind of totalitarian lineage, which then will culminate with Nazism and so forth. And this is an idea that many scholars have either proposed or questioned. So this is my first question for you. I would like to know your thoughts on that, because I think I wrote my thesis on political religions from Carl Schmitt and Eric Voegelin. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that. The second part of my question is about the concept of fuses on nature that you've pointed out in Plato. And one thing that I'd like to ask you also is, there's a huge contrast between Plato and Democritus in ancient world. Diogenes Laertius pointed out, whether it is true or not, we obviously don't know, that Plato had wished for all Democritus' book to be burned. And amongst all the ancient philosophers, he's the one that he does not talk about. And interestingly, scholars have also suggested that in the idea of changing one's own nature, rather than having born with a specific set, almost like the metallic Platonic nature, Democritus argued that through education, you can change your own nature. And so if you're born a slave, you can become a philosopher. I take it, I read it that way, right? If you're born a guardian, you can become a craftsman. So first, it's interesting that Plato, if that's true, as reported by Diogenes, had wished his books to be burned. And maybe when we read the influence of the atomistic tradition upon Marx, with Epicurus also, I mean, Marx wrote his PhD thesis on the difference between Democritus and Epicurus, right? And he pointed out that Epicurus argued through the Clinamen that we have freedom of will. And therefore, Marx has tried to destroy this kind of sacred versus secular, at least in my understanding, to go back to a materialist approach to nature, starting from what is the most fundamental equality amongst all, and that is the atoms. So all humans are trying to have a good life, they are looking for resources, and they want to be secure. And so I wonder, what are your thoughts in this difference between, you know, the atomistic tradition that completely Plato rejects in one way, even though he talks about geometric atomism, but we can leave it at that. So sorry if I went too long, but these two questions, I'd like to know your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. So one thing that you'll notice is that there is a lot of talk about reform of religion, because the Homeric stories involve portraying the gods as having various kinds of negative traits. And so if people are imitating gods that have negative traits, then they're going to get very lost indeed. And often, specifically, this is to do with naturalism for Plato. There's talk in the laws specifically about atheism as a kind of naturalism. So as specifically a lack of belief in these ideas, or the concept of the one, as something which is connected with everything and which everything is in relation to, and attempts instead to derive how you ought to behave by looking around at nature, or through purely empirical behavior, what seems to be successful in the natural world. When people do that, Plato suggests in the laws, they think that it's okay to do all kinds of injustice to other people because the animals do all kinds of injustice to each other. And so there's a tendency, if the gods are depicted in a naturalistic way, for the potential that's in the gods as concepts to not be effectively transmitted. So I think the sort of Platonic critique of, say, Nazi appropriations of Platonism would be that they're very highly naturalistic. They involve all kinds of appeals to nature thinking, which tends to, for Plato, cut us off from these higher kinds of possibilities that are not going to seem obviously there to us if we just look around at regular, ordinary behavior. If we engage in kind of empirical social science and look at what's normal or what's common behavior, we won't see these possibilities. They're quite difficult to develop. Now, I do think that there's some space in Platonism for the possibility that people's souls can change. So the myth of the metals, in which people have a fixed metal in their soul that makes them only one kind of thing, is a story. It's not necessarily the case that that's literally true. It's in the category of potentially noble lies, things that might be convenient if people believed. But at many other points in the dialogues, there's talk of people changing. So, for instance, Socrates at the end of the Phaedrus prays not to end up with too much money, because if he has too much money, then he might end up becoming caught up in that. It might change ultimately who he is. One thing that distinguishes the Platonists from, say, Stoics, the Stoics tend to affirm that you can be virtuous in any circumstance, that your virtue doesn't depend on the circumstance, because every person by nature has a capacity to be virtuous and to exercise reason in all circumstances. And if you don't do this, it's because it's your fate to fail to be virtuous. So it's in your nature to not be virtuous enough. For Plato and for Aristotle, there's much more of a focus on a capacity to create conditions which bring out human capabilities that are not otherwise ordinarily present or common. So a naturalistic or purely empiricist approach will tend to miss for Platonists these higher kinds of possibilities. And then I think in the case of Marxists, there's an attempt by Marxists to raise the level of society, but often without a recognition of these possibilities. However, there have been some interesting theories that have come out of the Marxist camp that have emphasized a more philosophical bent to Marx. So I'm thinking particularly of Scheringa, who recently wrote a book that came out just in 2025 called The Actualization of Philosophy from Cambridge University Press. And this is a book which proposes that Marx, rather than abandon philosophy, tries to actualize it. And if Marx is involved in trying to do something like that, then that would radically reframe the project. It would cease to be a kind of narrowly materialistic project and would potentially be something that might be able to be in more dialogue with Platonism, and certainly with Hegel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben, for that response. We might take one more or one more question online. We've got Cass there. So Cass, you could just perhaps unmute and ask your question. And if there's anyone else online who has a question, just put their hand up. Otherwise, we'll go back to the room. Okay, Cass.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I've lost my voice a bit. Absolutely fantastic presentation, Ben. That was really amazing. My question was just for someone that's kind of finding their way into ancient Greek philosophy and then comparing it with more modernistic takes. Do you have any specific readings or essays that will kind of further some of your points that you've made today?
Yeah. So in addition to the article that I published, which would give you kind of my immediate take on this, which it involves in its later stage a comparison of Plato with John Rawls and the way John Rawls thinks about acquiring moral powers. That would be Plato as a Theorist of Legitimacy, which I published with the International Journal of the Platonic Tradition. I think in terms of, one book that was very influential and contributed enormously to my work is Domenico Mira's book, Platonopolis, in which he tries to lay out in a great deal of detail what are the political implications of Neoplatonic theory. And he goes through in a rather systematic way each of those Neoplatonic philosophers. It's a great introduction to a lot of those different approaches in a relatively short volume. I also think that to get a sense of the sharpness of the contrast, it might be helpful to read Hobbes's Leviathan, and particularly the section in Hobbes's Leviathan where he criticizes the teaching of the classical texts, which I think really gives a very clear picture of why it is that moderns would not be interested in the Platonic texts being taught in the ways in which they were historically taught. That's something that is certainly not a Platonic view, but it's been an enormously influential view, and one that I think it's impossible to avoid. It's certainly a view that is going to be shaping in big ways the world that we live in, which is very corporate, involves a lot of state entities, involves a lot of emphasis on things like peace and on commodious living. So it's a very sharp contrast in terms of what the goals are and the ways in which human possibilities are conceived.
Thanks, Ben. I'll just mention one thing. I know using this room before that sometimes for the people in the room, this projector just turns off after about the time we've had so far. So we'll lose the image, but we'll still have everything else. So we'll just continue if it does go off, and then we'll have 5 minutes, and then it'll come back on again. Okay. So are there any more questions, comments, or reflections in the room? Just maybe anyone else before we go back to Chris? Okay, Chris.
So you talked of a book called The Actualizing of Philosophy, that immediately brought to mind the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which Marx wrote, I think, in 1948, was published 3 or 4 decades later. And Heidegger picked up that text.
Chris, do you just want to say what that is? Philosophers to this point.
Yeah. So this short thesis is that philosophy until now has merely interpreted the world, but the point is changing. So he's drawing a clear, he's saying, look, forget about philosophy, let's change the world, make it practical. And Heidegger picked up this text in front of a camera in 1969 and read it, and he said, look, it really doesn't make sense, because unless you are going to change things for the good, for the better, it has to be preceded by reflection. So we can call it here reflection philosophy. And I think he's dead right about that. So that thesis, I think, is some kind of rhetorical, just a rhetorical display. I don't think it's genuine. And it's quite proper that Marx is read philosophically, because it certainly can be. But I was quite taken. I've never heard anyone propose a kind of synthesis of Plato and Marx. So I look forward to thinking about this a bit more, because I think it's fairly ambitious. But they're quite right that both of them do want to, do have an ambition to improve things. And but my question though is this idea of divination of the human. This got wonderful expression in the first 3 or 4 centuries of Christianity with the church fathers, and particularly the West Enders, and including the Augustine, where he talks about more than most of them, the kenosis, of emptying yourself and being replaced by divine.
Yeah. So the intervention that Scheringa makes on this point is to say that when Marx says that the point philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it, he's not saying that we should abandon philosophy, but that philosophy should change the world. I think in the context in which he's saying that, there is a general lack of awareness of the degree to which the Platonists did try to change the world and had projects that were political. That's something that has really only been recovered in more recent decades, and which wasn't really a factor in the 19th century discussion. So I think that there may be more overlap there than it appears. I certainly agree with you that the theses on Feuerbach have historically been read as a rejection of philosophy, and that it's been very difficult within Marxism to work through that. But I think perhaps it can be read differently. Rather than a rejection of philosophy, it's a change in what philosophy is for or what its purpose is. But I think that the appropriate Platonic response might be to say that there were attempts to change the world with philosophy, but those attempts were not ultimately altogether terribly successful, insofar as they led up to things like the English Civil War, and then seemed to produce a need for a less ambitious kind of politics that was not interested in changing the world, but was just interested in preserving peace and order and commodious living. And so if you were to reopen the possibility of changing the world, you would have to do that in a way which would in some way return to philosophy and return to the potential of philosophy to generate change rather than just new attitudes or dispositions. That would be my thought.
Thank you, Benjamin. I was thinking of thesis 11. It is actually on the thesis 11 is on Marx's grave if you go to it in London in the cemetery. But it also has a special local connection too, because the new Platonists, something in new Marxists, something in new Marxism as the 60s, 70s, in Australia, they have a journal that is continuing today called Thesis 11. So there you go. And it's come up quite a bit, writings during the English Civil War and the British Civil War, I should say, and how important that is in the history of European ideas. And if anyone does want to read Hobbes, it's pretty short. We could do it in a class. It's just really powerful, really important. I think in some ways Machiavelli can be called in, and it's influential in important ways. But if people want to read that stuff, just come to us and we can have a chat about it. We don't have to just read Plato, because all this stuff is important. So look, thank you. I think we'll finish the questions then now. And just another thanks again to Ben for his wonderful talk.